On a cold November evening in 2003, a 19-year-old babysitter named Melissa Carter tucked a 4-year-old girl into bed, turned off the porch light of a quiet house on the edge of a small town called Ridgemont Hollow, and was never seen again. Neither was the little girl. Police searched the house. They searched the woods behind the property. They searched the frozen creek that cut through the neighborhood like a silver scar. Nothing. No footprints in the snow that shouldn't have been there. No blood. No forced door. No ransom call. Just an empty crib blanket folded neatly on a porch swing, swaying in the wind when the parents came home just after midnight. The case went cold within a year. Files were boxed. Detectives retired. The town moved on, the way towns do, quietly, guiltily, telling themselves it was easier not to look too hard at a wound that refused to heal. 19 years later, a cardboard box donated to a thrift store in a city 400 miles away would end up in the hands of a woman who had no idea she was about to unravel everything. Inside that box was a photograph, a single photograph, curling at the edges, hidden inside the lining of an old winter coat. What investigators uncovered next shocked everyone. Before we continue, if you enjoy mysteries, cold cases, and shocking investigations, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another mystery. Ridgemont Hollow was the kind of town where everyone waved from their porches and nobody locked their doors, at least not before that November. It sat in a shallow valley in the Appalachian foothills, wrapped in maple trees that turned the color of fire every October and buried under snow that came early and stayed late. Daniel and Ava Bennett had moved there 3 years before the disappearance, drawn by a listing for a Victorian house with a wraparound porch and more bedrooms than they needed. A house, Sarah said, felt like it was waiting for a family to fill it. Daniel worked as a regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company, a job that kept him on the road too, sometimes 3 nights a week. Sarah taught piano lessons out of the front parlor, and her students' scales drifted out the open windows every afternoon like something out of an old film. Their daughter, Ava, was 4 years old, a serious, watchful child with a gap-toothed smile and a stuffed rabbit named Pepper that she refused to sleep without. Neighbors would later describe Ava as unusually quiet for her age, the kind of child who seemed to be listening even when she appeared to be playing. Sarah had grown up an only child, or so she believed, raised by parents who doted on her but who kept a careful, unexplained silence about the earliest months of her infancy. A silence Sarah had never thought to question until much later in her life. She met Daniel at 24 at a friend's wedding and married him within a year. Drawn, she would later tell a therapist, to his steadiness, the way he seemed to have every detail of his life planned and controlled, a quality that had felt like safety at 25 and would come to feel like something else entirely by the time Ava was born. Daniel doted on his daughter in public, the kind of father who carried a diaper bag proudly through the grocery store and posted photographs of Ava's birthday parties online with captions about being the luckiest man alive. Neighbors adored him. He organized the block's 4th of July barbecue 2 years running. He coached a pee-wee soccer team. He had no daughter old enough to play on yet, simply because the town needed a coach, and Daniel liked being needed, liked being seen as the kind of man a town could rely on. It was a reputation that would follow him for 19 years, and one that made what investigators eventually uncovered almost impossible for people who thought they knew him to accept. Melissa Carter had been babysitting for the Bennetts for just over a year. She was a local girl, one of 4 siblings raised by a single mother who cleaned houses on the north side of town, a woman named Diane Carter who worked 6 days a week and still found time to sew Melissa's prom dress by hand the year before the disappearance. Melissa was saving for nursing school, working 2 jobs, the kind of teenager teachers described in yearbooks as going places. She volunteered at the hospital gift shop on weekends, a detail her mother would recount to reporters years later with a kind of desperate pride, as if reciting Melissa's goodness enough times might somehow bring her home. She had a boyfriend, Tyler Reeves, a 22-year-old mechanic with a temper that neighbors sometimes heard through thin apartment walls, though nothing more than raised voices, nothing anyone thought to report. Melissa loved Ava the way you love a little sister. She braided her hair into 2 uneven pigtails, which Ava insisted on wearing to preschool. She invented games with her, elaborate pretend worlds involving a stuffed rabbit kingdom that Melissa drew maps for on the backs of old receipts. She wrote in a spiral notebook, later recovered by police, short entries about Ava's day, what she ate, what cartoons she watched, small, mundane details that read, in hindsight, like the diary of someone building a life around a child that wasn't hers. Friends said Melissa dreamed of moving to Charlotte someday, of a life beyond Ridgemont Hollow, of becoming someone. Nobody imagined that dream would end with her disappearing off the face of the earth on a Tuesday night in November, taking a 4-year-old girl with her. The town itself seemed to hold its breath in the weeks after. Ridgemont Hollow had a single stoplight, a diner called the Copper Kettle, where the same 6 retirees drank coffee every morning at the same corner table, and a Baptist church whose steeple could be seen from nearly every yard in town. It was the kind of place where a missing child wasn't just a tragedy, it was a wound in the collective body of the community, something everyone carried, whether they'd known the Bennetts personally or not. Search parties formed within hours, farmers driving pickup trucks loaded with volunteers down every back road within 20 miles, church groups organizing casseroles and prayer vigils, the volunteer fire department setting up a command post in the elementary school gymnasium that would remain staffed in dwindling numbers for almost 3 months. And underneath all of that collective grief, a current of suspicion began to run through the town almost immediately. The quiet, uncomfortable question nobody wanted to say out loud. How does a teenage girl and a small child vanish from a locked house without anyone hearing a single sound? The Bennetts had gone to a company dinner 2 towns over, the kind of obligatory evening with Daniel's coworkers that Sarah dreaded and always came home from with a headache. They left just after 5. Melissa arrived at 5:15, let herself in with a spare key kept under a ceramic frog by the back door, and texted Sarah at 6 that Ava had eaten her dinner and was watching a movie. At 8:40, Melissa texted again. One word: bedtime. That was the last anyone heard from her. When Sarah and Daniel pulled into the driveway just after midnight, the porch light was off, though Melissa always left it on. The front door was unlocked, but not forced. Inside, the television was still playing to an empty living room, the volume low, throwing pale blue light across an untouched bowl of popcorn. Ava's bedroom door stood open. Her bed was empty except for a single stuffed rabbit and a blanket, folded, not thrown, not crumpled, folded, as if someone had taken the time to arrange it before leaving. Melissa's coat and purse were still on the hook by the door. Her car sat in the driveway, keys inside. There was no sign that either of them had left willingly, and no sign that they had been taken by force. It was as if the house had simply exhaled them into the night. Sarah Bennett would later describe that moment to investigators in a voice so flat it frightened them more than screaming would have. She said she walked into her daughter's room and felt the silence before she understood what it meant. She said the folded blanket was the detail she couldn't stop thinking about, because someone who was fleeing in panic does not fold a blanket. Someone who folds a blanket is either very calm or very practiced or trying to leave a message that no one, for 19 years, would understand. Word spread through Ridgemont Hollow before the sun came up. By morning, the Bennett's front yard was full of sheriff's deputies, state police cruisers, and neighbors standing in bathrobes at the edge of their lawns, arms crossed against the cold, watching a search dog handler lead a bloodhound in slow circles around the porch. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, the kind of smell that clings to a small town in late November, and above the tree line, the sky hung low and gray, the color of old newspaper, threatening a snow that wouldn't fall for another 2 days. The dog picked up a scent that led to the edge of the property, into the tree line, and then stopped cold at the frozen creek, as though the trail had simply been swallowed by the water. The handler, a state trooper named Vasquez, who had worked search and rescue for 11 years, would later say he had never seen a dog behave the way that Bloodhound did at the creek's edge, pacing back and forth along the bank, whining low in its throat, refusing to cross even when encouraged, as if the water itself held something the animal didn't want to name. Divers were brought in 3 days later, cutting through ice that had already begun to form at the creek's shallow edges. They found nothing. Nobody, no clothing, no evidence that anyone had gone into that creek at all. Sheriff Carl Whitfield, a man 18 months from retirement who had never worked a case bigger than a barn fire, stood at the edge of that creek in a county-issued parka 2 sizes too big for him, and later told a reporter it felt like the town itself was hiding something and he didn't know where to start digging. He would spend the better part of that winter running on almost no sleep, driving the same stretch of county roads at 2 in the morning, half hoping to catch headlights that shouldn't be there, half hoping just to feel like he was doing something other than waiting for a phone call that never came. Detectives searched the Bennett house top to bottom, moving room to room with the slow, careful thoroughness that comes only after a search team realizes there is no urgency left to chase, only questions. They found Melissa's spiral notebook in her babysitting bag, filled with those small daily entries about Ava, the handwriting rounded and careful in the early pages, growing tighter and more hurried in the final weeks before the disappearance, a detail no one thought to examine closely until 19 years later. They found nothing unusual in the Bennett's finances, no debts, no life insurance policies large enough to raise eyebrows, no affairs, at least none that surfaced in that first round of interviews. They found Melissa's phone records showed no calls that night after the text to Sarah at 8:40. Her bank account hadn't been touched. It was as though two people had simply stepped out of their own lives mid-sentence, leaving behind every ordinary trace of themselves, a toothbrush still damp in the bathroom, a half-finished glass of milk in the refrigerator with Ava's initials drawn on the label in marker, a stack of Melissa's nursing school brochures still rubber-banded together on her nightstand at home. Investigators noted one strange detail that never made it into the local paper. A single hair, dark blonde, was found tangled in the porch swing where the folded blanket had been placed, which did not match Melissa's hair color, Ava's hair color, or either of the Bennetts. It was bagged, tagged, and tested for what 2003 forensic technology could manage, which in a small county lab meant a basic comparison analysis rather than the genetic sequencing that would later crack the case wide open. The result came back inconclusive, filed away as a likely contaminant, perhaps from a previous visitor to the porch, and largely forgotten by everyone except a young detective named Frank Callahan, freshly assigned to the case, who circled it 3 times in his own private notes with a question mark beside it that he would carry for the next 2 decades. It would sit in an evidence locker for 19 years, boxed and shelved through 2 department relocations and 1 near disposal during a records purge that Callahan, by then long departed from the force, would personally intervene to stop, waiting for science to catch up to the mystery. Reporters descended on Ridgemont Hollow within the first week, satellite trucks lining the narrow street outside the Bennett house, and the story ran on regional news for 3 consecutive nights before a larger network picked it up nationally, drawn by the eerie, almost theatrical strangeness of the folded blanket, a detail that seemed to capture something the public couldn't look away from. Sarah gave one brief, devastating press conference, standing beside Daniel with her hands shaking so badly she had to hold a printed statement with both hands to keep it steady, pleading for whoever had her daughter to bring her home safely, to know that she was loved, that her family was waiting. Daniel stood beside her throughout, his hand resting on the small of her back. His expression, several reporters would later note in their coverage, unusually composed for a man whose child had just vanished, a detail that meant nothing to anyone in 2003 and would mean everything 19 years later. But investigators would soon discover something that made the case even stranger, something that turned a missing persons report into a town-wide nightmare that no one could explain. 3 weeks into the search, a hiker walking her dog along an old logging road found a child's shoe half buried in mud nearly 2 miles from the Bennett house. On the far side of a wooded ridge, the search teams had already combed twice. It was small, pink, with a cartoon cat stitched onto the toe, and it was, within the hour, confirmed by Sarah Bennett, her voice breaking as she held it in both hands, to be Ava's shoe, the one her daughter had worn the very morning before she disappeared. The discovery reignited the entire search overnight. Sheriff Whitfield's team returned to that ridge with fresh volunteers, cadaver dogs, and a renewed, desperate hope that had been draining out of the town for 3 weeks. They searched that ridge for a week and found nothing else. No other clothing, no trace of a struggle, nothing to suggest a child had walked or been carried 2 miles through dense forest in the middle of a November night, through underbrush thick enough to tear at bare skin and temperatures cold enough to be dangerous for an adult, let alone a 4-year-old in pajamas. The shoe sat alone in the mud, as if it had been placed there rather than lost, and the more forensic techs examined it, the less sense it made. There were no soil transfer patterns consistent with a child walking that distance, no scuff marks matching the terrain between the house and the ridge, no signs of dragging, nothing that made physical sense given the story the shoe seemed to be telling. One young forensic technician, reviewing the file years later during the reopened investigation, would describe the shoe's placement as almost theatrical, positioned in a small clearing rather than tangled in brush the way a genuinely lost item tends to be, angled, oddly, so that it would be visible to anyone walking the logging road in daylight rather than hidden the way panic and darkness usually leave things. It was the first of many details in this case that seemed designed, deliberately, by someone, to be found and to explain nothing, a breadcrumb leading everyone in exactly the wrong direction while the truth moved quietly somewhere else entirely. The investigation turned, as investigations do, toward the people closest to the victims. Tyler Reeves, Melissa's boyfriend, became the first person of real interest, and for a long, uncomfortable season, the closest thing the town had to a villain to hate. He had no alibi for that night, claiming he'd been alone at his apartment watching television, a claim no one could confirm or deny. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices through his walls 2 nights before the disappearance, an argument between Tyler and Melissa that no one could quite make out beyond a few sharp fragments. Melissa's voice rising to something close to panic, Tyler's voice low and insistent. The argument ending, one neighbor recalled, with the sound of a door slamming hard enough to rattle a window frame. When detectives searched his apartment, they found a receipt for a storage unit rented under a different name 3 days before Melissa vanished, a detail that made Sheriff Whitfield's pulse quicken so sharply he personally drove out to the storage facility at 11 at night with a warrant hastily approved by a judge roused from bed. Inside, deputies found nothing but stolen car parts, engine components, and stripped-down transmissions from an unrelated chop shop theft ring Tyler had been quietly running on the side for extra cash, embarrassing, criminal, and entirely unconnected to 2 missing people. Tyler would spend 8 months as the town's presumed monster. His name whispered in grocery store aisles, spray-painted once across the hood of his car. His mother's mailbox vandalized twice by people who had never met him but felt certain, in the absence of any other explanation, that he must be guilty of something. He was questioned 4 separate times, his phone records combed line by line, his known associates interviewed, his movements on the night in question reconstructed hour by hour by investigators desperate for any thread to pull. Nothing held. Charges related to the disappearance were formally dropped for lack of any evidence at all, though the theft ring charges stuck, earning him 18 months in a county facility that he would later say felt, in a strange way, like a mercy, because at least inside those walls, people stopped looking at him like he'd buried a child somewhere in the woods. He left Ridgemont Hollow in 2005 and never came back. He always maintained, to the one reporter who tracked him down years later working at a garage outside Knoxville, that Melissa had been scared of something in the weeks before she disappeared, scared of something she wouldn't name, jumpy in a way she'd never been before, checking over her shoulder in parking lots, and that he had begged her, more than once, to just tell him what was wrong so he could help her. Sarah's younger sister, Denise, became a quieter subject of suspicion within the family itself, though never formally investigated by police in any serious way. Denise had been engaged in a bitter, years-long dispute with Sarah over their late father's estate, a modest inheritance tied up in a family property that Sarah had inherited outright after their father's death. A decision Denise felt had been unfairly influenced by their mother's fondness for Sarah's steady, respectable marriage over Denise's own messier life choices. Neighbors who knew the family well recalled Denise commenting at a holiday gathering the year before, half joking, glass of wine in hand, about how convenient it would be if something happened to disrupt Sarah's tidy little life, a comment that had drawn an uncomfortable laugh from the table at the time and a much colder read in hindsight. It was the kind of remark family members forget until a tragedy makes them remember it in a different light, replaying it over and over, wondering if they'd missed a warning sign hiding inside an ordinary bit of sibling resentment. Denise had no connection to Melissa Carter, no known contact with Ava beyond the occasional holiday visit, and an alibi, a dinner with coworkers celebrating a colleague's promotion that a dozen witnesses corroborated without hesitation down to the minute. But for a brief, tense season, whispers followed her through town too. Phone calls that stopped coming from old friends, a job interview that mysteriously fell through after the interviewer recognized her last name, whispers she would later say cost her a marriage, and a decade of estrangement from her sister, built on nothing more than grief looking for somewhere, anywhere, to land. Then there was Frank Callahan, the young detective assigned to the case straight out of the state academy, 26 years old and hungry to prove himself in a department that had never handled anything more complicated than livestock theft and the occasional bar fight. Callahan became obsessed in the healthy sense, and then, his colleagues would say, in the unhealthy sense, with a detail almost everyone else dismissed as background noise in an already chaotic case. Ava's pediatrician's file, requested in the early weeks of the investigation, showed the Bennetts had canceled 2 well-child appointments in the 6 months before the disappearance, both rescheduled and then quietly allowed to lapse entirely, and that Ava had been seen once at an urgent care clinic 40 minutes outside Ridgemont Hollow, a clinic notably outside the family's usual healthcare network, for what was recorded only as a minor injury. Callahan pulled the urgent care record himself, driving out on his day off because the request had been sitting in an administrative queue for 2 weeks. It described a bruise on Ava's upper arm. Consistent, the attending physician had written in careful, non-committal clinical language, with a fall, though the physician had also noted, almost as an afterthought, scrawled in the margin, that the child seemed unusually anxious around her father during the exam, flinching when he stepped close to the exam table, quieting the moment he spoke. Sarah Bennett, when asked about the visit, said Ava had fallen off a swing set at a friend's birthday party, an explanation offered quickly, almost automatically. Daniel Bennett, when asked separately, in a different room, by a different officer, said he didn't recall the incident at all, a discrepancy that struck Callahan as odd for a father whose daughter had needed medical attention just months before she vanished. Callahan wrote in his own notes, later found still paper-clipped inside a manila folder when the reopened case file was pulled from storage 19 years later, 4 words that would haunt the investigation for 2 decades, underlined twice in blue ink. Something is not right. He raised the concern to Sheriff Whitfield twice in the first month of the investigation. Both times, he was told the case had bigger fish to fry, a missing child and a missing babysitter, not a bruised arm from a swing set, and that chasing domestic theories would only slow down a search effort that needed to stay focused on finding 2 bodies or 2 survivors, wherever they might be. There were other names, too, that surfaced and faded during those first frantic months, the way names always do in a case with no clear suspect and a town desperate for one. A drifter who had been seen at the diner twice that week was questioned and released within a day, his alibi, a bus ticket stub, and a diner receipt time-stamped 2 towns over, holding up without complication. A registered sex offender living 11 miles outside Ridgemont Hollow became the subject of intense, almost obsessive attention for nearly 2 weeks. His house watched around the clock by volunteers who took shifts in lawn chairs at the end of his driveway, until cell tower records placed him definitively at his sister's house in another state for the entire week surrounding the disappearance. Even Sarah and Daniel's next-door neighbor, a retired mail carrier named Gene Holloway, who had once complained loudly about the piano lessons carrying through his walls every afternoon, found himself fielding uncomfortable questions after someone mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been seen walking his dog unusually late the night Ava vanished. Gene cooperated fully, mortified, and was cleared within days, though he would tell people for years afterward that he'd never felt the particular sting of a town's suspicion the way he did that November, over nothing more than a late-night walk with an aging beagle. Each of these threads consumed real investigative hours, real emotional energy from a town that didn't have much of either to spare, and each of them, in the end, led nowhere. Small tragedies of wasted suspicion layered on top of the larger tragedy at the center of it all. Sheriff Whitfield would later say the hardest part of those early weeks wasn't the absence of leads, it was the abundance of them. Dozens of tips a day pouring into a department with only 6 deputies, each one requiring careful, respectful attention, because any one of them, however unlikely, might be the detail that broke the case wide open. None of them were. The case would not break for 19 more years, and when it finally did, it would break not because of a tip called into a hotline, but because of a coat, forgotten in a storage unit, waiting patiently for someone to need the money badly enough to stop paying the rent on a secret. If you're enjoying this investigation so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel continue bringing you stories like this. Now let's continue, because what investigators uncovered next was even more disturbing. The case sat cold for 18 years, the way cases do, not through any single decision, but through a slow accumulation of exhausted leads and reassigned detectives and a public attention span that, however much the town loved Ava and mourned her, could not sustain itself indefinitely against the absence of any new information. Sheriff Whitfield retired in 2005, still haunted, by his own admission, by the folded blanket, a detail he brought up unprompted in his retirement speech, telling the room of deputies and well-wishers that he'd solved every case in his career except the one that mattered most, and that he hoped whoever came after him would keep the file open even after everyone stopped asking about it. Frank Callahan left the sheriff's department in 2011, disillusioned by a system that let cases like Ava's simply calcify into paperwork, boxes stacked in a records room that flooded twice in the years that followed, evidence bags growing brittle with age, and became a private investigator specializing in cold cases, taking on paying work to support himself while quietly reopening the Bennett file on his own time every few years, running Melissa's name and Ava's age-progressed photograph through whatever new database or forensic technique became available, filing public records requests that mostly came back empty, driving out to interview aging witnesses whose memories grew less reliable with every passing year. Daniel and Sarah Bennett divorced in 2007, the strain of an unsolved disappearance eroding a marriage that friends said had already been fragile. Daniel growing distant and irritable in a way Sarah attributed at the time to grief, though she would later come to understand it differently. Sarah stayed in Ridgemont Hollow for another decade, teaching piano to a shrinking roster of students, keeping Ava's room untouched down to the stuffed animals arranged exactly as they'd been left, keeping the porch light on every single night, regardless of season or weather, a small private ritual the whole town came to recognize and respect, neighbors sometimes leaving flowers on her porch steps. On the anniversary of the disappearance, without ever knocking, without ever needing to say anything at all, Daniel moved to Ohio within a year of the divorce, remarried a woman named Carol, who by all accounts knew almost nothing of the specifics of his first marriage beyond the broad, tragic outline of a stepdaughter who had vanished, and largely disappeared from the case's public narrative, giving occasional brief statements to reporters on anniversaries. Statements neighbors and even Sarah herself would later describe as strangely rehearsed, word for word identical from one year to the next, as though he were reciting lines rather than reliving a wound. Melissa's mother, Diane Carter, never stopped believing her daughter was alive, a conviction she held onto through 2 strokes and a diagnosis that would eventually take her life in 2019, 3 years before the truth finally surfaced, a fact that would become one of the quietest tragedies buried inside a story already full of them. She kept a framed photograph of Melissa on her kitchen table for 19 years, a chair pulled out beside it at every holiday meal, an old habit her surviving children indulged without comment, understanding that some grief simply needs a place at the table. Then, in the spring of 2022, a woman named Priya Nair was sorting through a donation bin at a thrift store in Asheville, nearly 400 miles from Ridgemont Hollow, where she volunteered 2 days a week ever since her own daughter had moved away to college and left her with a quiet house and too much time to fill. She was steaming and hanging a decades-old wool coat that had come in with a bag of estate donations from a storage unit auction, the kind of unclaimed lot that thrift stores buy in bulk when nobody comes to pay the rent, sight unseen, a gamble that usually turns up nothing more interesting than moth holes and mildew. As she worked the iron along the coat's lining, she felt something stiff beneath the fabric, a shape that didn't belong, rectangular, firm, tucked into a seam that had been hand-stitched rather than factory sewn, a detail that struck her as odd even before she understood why. She cut a few stitches with a seam ripper from the shop's sewing kit, expecting a forgotten receipt or a moth-eaten scrap of newspaper used as insulation. Instead, she found a photograph, folded in quarters, protected from decades of handling by the coat's lining. The paper soft at the creases the way old photographs get when they've been folded and unfolded many times by someone who couldn't quite bear to put them away for good. It showed a woman who looked to be in her early 20s standing in front of a small blue house, holding the hand of a little girl who could not have been older than 5, both of them squinting slightly against sunlight. Both of them, Priya would later say, wearing an expression that looked less like posing for a photograph and more like the quiet, unguarded happiness of 2 people who didn't know or care that anyone was watching. On the back, in handwriting that had faded to the color of weak tea, someone had written a single sentence: "She is safe. Please don't look for us. No names, no date." No location beyond the pale blue house in the background, its porch decorated with a wind chime shaped like a sun and a row of terracotta pots that had, at the time the photo was taken, held nothing but dirt and the promise of a garden. Priya almost threw it away. She almost didn't think twice about it, tempted simply to set it in the donation bin's discard pile along with a button that had come off the coat's sleeve. But something about the sentence unsettled her enough that she took a picture of both sides with her phone and posted it to a local community forum that evening, half joking, asking if anyone recognized the house or knew the story behind such an odd little note, adding, almost as an afterthought, that it felt like something out of a movie. Within 48 hours, that post had been shared into a true crime forum, then into a missing persons Facebook group with over 200,000 members, the kind of online community that spends its evenings poring over decades-old flyers with an intensity most people reserve for their own families, where a woman in Ohio who had followed the Ava Bennett case since childhood, since her own mother, had shown her the flyer in a grocery store window and told her to always stay close, recognized something in the shape of the little girl's face, the particular set of her eyes, that made her stomach drop. She sent the post to Frank Callahan, whose contact information she'd kept saved in her phone for 6 years after reading an old newspaper profile about his refusal to let this case die. Callahan drove to Asheville within the week, 400 miles behind the wheel of a car that badly needed new brakes, fueled by a mixture of caffeine and a feeling he would later describe as something between hope and dread. He tracked the storage unit's ownership history through property records and auction paperwork, spending 3 days in a county records office cross-referencing transfer documents, a trail that led back through 3 transfers of ownership over 19 years to a woman who had rented the unit under the name Rebecca Hale, paying in cash every month from 2004 until the payments abruptly stopped in early 2023, at which point the unit's contents, unclaimed and unpaid, were auctioned off for back fees. The fateful auction that had sent that wool coat into a donation bag and, eventually, into Priya Nair's hands. Rebecca Hale did not exist in any state's birth records, did not exist in any school enrollment database, did not exist anywhere before a rental application filed in 2004 that Callahan finally located through a retired property manager willing to dig through boxes in his garage as a favor. Her driver's license, scanned and grainy, showed a face that made his hands shake when he pulled it up on his laptop screen in a diner booth outside Asheville, coffee going cold in front of him. It was Melissa Carter, 19 years older, her hair dyed dark instead of the honey blonde everyone in Ridgemont Hollow remembered, her face fuller, softened by age, but her eyes the same, unmistakably the same, watchful eyes that Callahan had stared at in a missing persons flyer taped to his own refrigerator for 2 decades. But that wasn't the only lie hidden in that storage unit's paper trail. When Callahan requested the full auction inventory from the storage facility, cross-referencing every item against Priya's photograph line by line at the diner table until the waitress started refilling his coffee without being asked, he found something that stopped him cold. Buried in an old shoebox of documents, tucked between an expired car insurance card and a child's finger painting still creased from years of folding, was a laminated library card issued by the Asheville Public Library System in 2006 under yet another name. Ava Hale, age 7 at the time of issuance, the plastic edges softened and rounded from what must have been thousands of trips through a book drop slot. The girl who had vanished at 4 years old had grown up, under a new name, in a small blue house 400 miles from home, raised by the woman everyone believed had either kidnapped her for some unknowable reason or died alongside her in those cold November woods 19 years before. And she had been, according to the library card renewal history that stretched all the way to 2021, still very much alive, checking out books, living something that looked, on paper, disturbingly close to an ordinary life. Frank Callahan's next move nearly ended his investigation before it could begin and would later draw sharp criticism from the department he was trying to help. He located a forwarding address connected to the abandoned storage unit, a small rental house on the outskirts of Asheville with a wraparound porch, not unlike the one Ava Bennett had disappeared from 19 years earlier, an echo Callahan noticed and couldn't quite explain even to himself, and drove there directly, alone, without notifying local police or the reopened task force, a decision he would later admit was reckless and driven by 19 years of pent-up obsession that had, by that point, cost him a marriage of his own. The house was empty, curtains still hanging in the windows, a child's bicycle rusting quietly in the side yard, as though someone had simply walked away one afternoon and never come back for it. Neighbors said the woman who lived there, quiet, kept to herself, worked nights as a home health aide at a nearby hospice, had moved out abruptly 3 months earlier without explanation, taking almost nothing with her, leaving furniture, dishes, even a half-planted garden bed behind. One neighbor, an elderly man who had watered her plants when she traveled and occasionally shared coffee with her on Sunday mornings, mentioned that her daughter, a young woman in her 20s who visited only rarely, had come by only once in recent months, tense and tearful, arguing in low voices on the front porch late into the night, before leaving the same night in a car with out-of-state plates. That the neighbor, with the kind of small-town attentiveness that would prove invaluable, had partially remembered. They had been looking at the wrong ending all along, all of them, for 19 years. Melissa Carter, or Rebecca Hale, or whoever she had truly become through however many names it had taken to stay hidden, had run again, spooked, it seemed, by something, though what exactly remained unclear. And this time she had a 26-year-old woman with her who might be, if Callahan's theory was correct, and every fiber of his 19-year instinct told him it was, Ava Bennett herself, alive and walking around under a name no one in Ridgemont Hollow had ever heard, a woman who had grown up entirely unaware, perhaps, of the storm that had raged around her disappearance since she was 4 years old. Callahan brought everything to the Asheville Police Department and, through them, back to a very different Ridgemont Hollow Sheriff's Department than the one that had failed this case in 2003, a department now led by a sheriff who had grown up hearing about the Bennett case as a kind of local ghost story and was determined not to let it slip away a second time. Modern forensic genealogy was requested on file evidence, including that unidentified dark blonde hair recovered from the porch swing 19 years earlier and preserved, almost by accident, in an evidence locker that had survived 2 department relocations, a flood, and 1 records purge that Callahan had personally driven 3 hours to stop with nothing more than a strongly worded phone call and a promise to pay the storage fees himself. The sample, brittle but intact, was sent to a private forensic genealogy lab that specialized in exactly this kind of decades-old, degraded evidence, technicians extracting a genetic profile through techniques that hadn't existed anywhere in 2003. Genetic genealogists ran the profile through public DNA databases, the same kind of consumer genealogy sites that had cracked open dozens of cold cases across the country in the years since their popularity exploded, and within 3 weeks returned a result that reframed the entire case in a way nobody, not Callahan, not the new sheriff, not a single armchair detective following along online, had predicted. The hair belonged to a woman named Colette Marsh, deceased since 2015 according to a death certificate filed in a small town 2 states away, who turned out, through a painstaking build-out of a family tree stretching back 3 generations, to be Sarah Bennett's biological mother, a woman Sarah herself had believed dead since infancy, or more accurately had simply never known existed at all, given up during a closed adoption that Sarah, incredibly, had never been told about by the family who raised her. A family who had, by all accounts, made the decision decades earlier to bury that chapter of Sarah's life so completely that even Sarah's own adoptive parents' closest friends had no idea it had ever happened. Someone had lied, someone had hidden evidence. And someone, it turned out, had been quietly orchestrating events from the shadows of this family for far longer than anyone imagined. The revelation sent Callahan back to Sarah Bennett, now 51 years old and living alone in the same Victorian house, the porch light still burning every night out of 19 years of habit she could no longer break even after learning her daughter might, impossibly, still be alive. He sat with her at her kitchen table, the same table where she had once graded her students' scale exercises and slid the photograph of Colette Marsh across the surface between them, an old, formal adoption record photo of a woman in her 30s with a face that carried, unmistakably, the same set of eyes Sarah saw in the mirror every morning. Sarah went pale, her hand rising slowly to cover her mouth, and admitted something she had buried so deeply over the decades that she had nearly convinced herself it wasn't true, a memory she had filed away as unimportant precisely because she'd had no context to understand its importance. In the year before Ava's disappearance, an elderly woman had begun appearing at the edges of Sarah's life in small, unsettling increments, at Sarah's piano recitals seated alone in the back row, at the grocery store lingering near the produce section whenever Sarah shopped, once even at church, standing near the entrance during a Christmas Eve service, always at a distance, always watching with an intensity Sarah had found strange enough to mention out loud, but not strange enough, at the time, to report to anyone. Sarah had mentioned it to Daniel at the time, unsettled, describing the woman's persistent, quiet presence, and Daniel had dismissed it almost immediately as a lonely old woman with nothing better to do, an explanation Sarah had accepted because it was easier than sitting with the discomfort of not knowing. Sarah had never connected that woman to her own unknown birth mother because she had never known she had one to connect her to, her adoptive parents having taken that secret to their own graves years before the disappearance ever happened. Colette Marsh, it turned out, according to records eventually pieced together from an adoption reunion registry and a handful of letters recovered from her modest apartment after her death, had spent the final 2 years of her life trying, in increasingly desperate and clumsy ways, to get close to the granddaughter she had only just learned existed after decades of searching, of filing paperwork with agencies that took years to respond, of hoping quietly that somewhere out there a daughter she'd given up as a frightened 20-year-old might still want to know her. But if Colette Marsh had been circling the family, watching, why would her hair end up on a porch swing the night Ava vanished, tangled in a blanket folded with such deliberate care? Callahan's working theory, the one that made his stomach turn as he wrote it into his report, was that Colette Marsh had been present at the house that night, not as a kidnapper, as a witness, and possibly, terrifyingly, as the one person who understood exactly why Melissa Carter needed to disappear. The investigation now widened far beyond anything Sheriff Whitfield could have imagined in 2003, pulling in people who had spent 19 years believing they had nothing left to add to a story they'd long ago accepted would never be finished. Callahan and the reopened task force began pulling every thread methodically, working through a list of names that had grown dusty in the original case file, tracking down witnesses across half a dozen states, some cooperative, some reluctant to reopen a wound they'd spent 2 decades trying to close. Old detectives who had worked the original case in 2003 were re-interviewed, several now in their 70s and 80s, memories softened and sharpened in unpredictable places by the passage of time, and one, a retired deputy named Roy Pierce, sitting in a recliner in a modest home 2 counties over with an oxygen tank humming quietly beside him, revealed something he had sat on for 19 years. Out of what he called, his voice cracking, professional shame he'd never been able to forgive himself for. In the initial 48 hours of the investigation, before the case exploded into statewide news and the department was flooded with additional manpower, Roy had been the one to canvass the pediatrician's office and the urgent care clinic, a routine assignment nobody had thought much of at the time. He had personally interviewed the physician who examined Ava's bruised arm, and the physician, off the record, in the kind of quiet aside doctors sometimes offer when official channels feel inadequate, had told him she suspected the child was afraid of her father, that something about the exam had unsettled her enough to mention it even without concrete proof. Roy had documented that suspicion in a preliminary note, handwritten, meant to be typed up and filed formally within the week, a note that mysteriously never made it into the official case file handed over to Sheriff Whitfield when the investigation scaled up. Roy claimed, sitting in that recliner 19 years later, that the note had simply been lost in the chaos of an understaffed department working its first major case in a decade, boxes of paperwork shuffled between 3 overwhelmed clerks and a fax machine that jammed more often than it worked. Callahan, and later prosecutors reviewing the timeline, would come to doubt that explanation entirely, suspecting instead that the note had been quietly buried by someone higher up who found the domestic angle inconvenient, embarrassing, or simply too complicated to chase down while a town was demanding answers about stranger danger and kidnapping rings. Teachers from Ava's preschool were tracked down, several now retired and living in different states entirely, their memories jogged by old class photographs Callahan brought with him to each interview. 1. A woman named Ellen Marsh, no relation to Colette despite the coincidence of the surname, recalled with startling clarity once prompted an incident nobody had ever reported to police in 2003. Ava flinching visibly whenever her father arrived early to pick her up from the classroom, shrinking back toward the reading corner rather than running to greet him the way most 4-year-olds ran to their parents. An observation the teacher had mentioned once to Sarah in passing at pickup, gently, the way you raise a concern you're not sure is really a concern, watching Sarah's face carefully for a reaction that never quite came. Sarah, interviewed again by Callahan in her kitchen, the same kitchen, broke down for the first time in the entire investigation, 19 years of carefully constructed denial finally giving way all at once, and admitted that in the months before the disappearance, her marriage had been deteriorating in ways she had hidden from everyone, including, in a sense, herself, having spent so long minimizing. What she saw that she'd nearly convinced herself there was nothing to see. Daniel's temper, controlled and calculated rather than explosive, the kind that never left visible marks in front of witnesses, had begun directing itself at Ava during his stretches home from work. Small cruelties dressed up as discipline, an isolating coldness that left the little girl anxious and withdrawn in ways Sarah had rationalized as a phase, as stress, as exhaustion, as anything other than. What a family therapist would later, in a report commissioned during the reopened investigation and built from testimony, medical records, and behavioral analysis spanning the child's earliest years, describe as a documented pattern of covert emotional and physical abuse of a small child by her father, the kind that leaves no obvious bruises but reshapes a child's entire understanding of safety. Melissa Carter, the babysitter everyone in Ridgemont Hollow had spent 19 years imagining as either a victim or a monster, had, according to a resurfacing piece of evidence, known. A childhood friend of Melissa's, a woman named Beth Ann Coker, tracked down by Callahan in a suburb outside Knoxville after 19 years of no contact with anyone connected to the case, finally produced something she had kept hidden in a shoebox at the back of her closet for 19 years out of fear and grief, and a promise she'd made to a 19-year-old girl the week before that girl vanished. From the world entirely. Beth Ann cried through most of the interview, apologizing over and over for not coming forward sooner, explaining that she had been terrified as a teenager that revealing the letter would somehow implicate her, or worse, that no one would believe a piece of paper over the version of events the whole town had already decided on. It was a letter, undated, in Melissa's unmistakable looping handwriting. The kind of handwriting still practicing its adult signature, describing things she had witnessed while babysitting that she didn't know what to do with, describing a little girl who flinched at raised voices from the next room and who once told Melissa, in the small, flat way children sometimes deliver devastating truths without understanding their weight, that her daddy said if she told anyone about the bad nights, he would send Pepper the rabbit away forever, that Pepper would go live somewhere Ava could never visit. The letter described Melissa's own escalating fear as she watched a child she loved retreat further into herself month after month, describing an attempt Melissa had made to raise her concerns gently with Sarah, an attempt that had been met, according to the letter, with a flash of defensive anger that frightened Melissa into silence for weeks afterward. It described sleepless nights, a growing conviction that no official channel, no school counselor, no anonymous hotline call would move fast enough or believe her enough to actually protect Ava before something irreversible happened. The letter ended with a line that made Callahan's hands shake for the second time in this investigation. A line Beth Ann said she had reread so many times over 19 years that the paper had worn soft along the fold. "I don't know what I'm going to do, but I can't just watch this and do nothing. If something happens to me, please know I did it, because nobody else would help her, and because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." Everyone had been wrong about who the villain of this story was, and everyone had been wrong about who the hero was, too. The final pieces came together slowly, methodically, over the course of several more months of investigation, in a way that reframed 19 years of grief into something both more tragic and more redemptive than anyone had expected. Least of all Frank Callahan, who had spent so long imagining monsters that he found himself, for the first time in this entire case, crying at his desk over an old woman's handwriting rather than raging at it. Colette Marsh, Sarah's biological mother, had been a woman with a complicated past of her own, including prosecutors would learn from records painstakingly assembled across 3 states, a career decades earlier in social work, specializing for a time in child welfare cases before a personal tragedy, the loss of a second child she had raised to a car accident in the early 1990s, pushed her out of the field entirely and into a long, quiet period of grief and withdrawal from which she never fully recovered. When she reconnected with Sarah's world from a careful distance in the early 2000s, having finally tracked Sarah down through years of patient searching and an adoption reunion registry that took nearly a decade to yield a match, she chose to watch her granddaughter from afar rather than risk rejection by announcing herself outright, terrified, her journal suggested, that a woman who already had a family might not want an aging stranger inserting herself into it. She had, by her own admission in a journal, recovered from a storage unit she'd kept under yet another alias entirely. A journal investigators would spend weeks poring over line by line, noticed the same signs Ava's preschool teacher and pediatrician had noticed, her decades of social work experience giving her a trained eye for exactly the kind of quiet, unspoken fear she saw flicker across her granddaughters, faced during the handful of times she managed to observe the family from a distance. Colette had approached Melissa Carter directly, twice, in the weeks before the disappearance, once outside the grocery store and once, more deliberately, waiting near the babysitting job's bus stop, introducing herself only as a concerned family friend who had noticed things too, and had asked Melissa point-blank whether she believed the child was safe in that house. Melissa, terrified and unsure who to trust, given that her own attempts to raise concerns with Sarah had been met with denial and a flash of defensiveness that frightened her into silence, had eventually confided everything to this strange, watchful older woman who seemed, unlike everyone else in Melissa's young life, willing to actually listen without dismissing her. Together, according to the journal, over the course of several secret conversations, they had made a plan neither of them fully understood the legal or emotional consequences of, a plan built entirely out of fear and improvisation rather than any careful strategy. Colette had contacts, remnants of an old underground network from her social work years, people who had helped women and children disappear from dangerous households before the modern legal system had adequate protections in place, a loosely connected, informal, deeply illegal system built on desperation rather than due process, the kind of network that exists in the shadows precisely because the systems, meant to protect children, so often fail to move quickly enough. On the night of November 2003, while the Bennetts attended their company dinner across town, Colette had arrived at the house just after dark, parking a borrowed car 2 streets over and walking the rest of the way to avoid being seen. Melissa, the journal indicated, had been the one to make the final decision, alone, at 8:40 in the evening, sitting on the edge of Ava's bed, watching the little girl sleep for nearly 10 minutes before she could bring herself to act, sending that last text to Sarah, bedtime, a single ordinary word meant to buy time rather than deceive, before folding Ava's blanket with hands the journal described, as shaking so badly she could barely manage the corners. A small, almost involuntary act of care in the middle of an unimaginable decision, and carrying the sleeping child out into a car waiting at the end of the driveway. Ava barely stirring, murmuring only for Pepper before drifting back to sleep against Melissa's shoulder. The shoe left on the ridge 2 miles away had been a deliberate, desperate misdirection, planted by Colette the following morning before search efforts fully mobilized, driving out to that logging road specifically because she knew, from her old work, exactly how search patterns typically formed around a missing child, and positioning it carefully to send any search effort toward the woods rather than toward the highway on-ramp less than a mile in the opposite direction, buying the two of them precious hours, maybe even days, before anyone realized which direction to actually look. Melissa Carter had not been kidnapped. She had not been murdered. She had made, at 19 years old, a catastrophic, illegal, and, according to every piece of evidence the investigation uncovered, deeply loving decision to disappear with a child she believed no one else would save. The massive revelation reshaped everything the audience and the town had believed for 19 years. There had been no monster lurking in the woods. There had been no trafficking ring, no cult, no stranger's van. The truth had been hiding inside the one house everyone had trusted completely, and the kidnapping that consumed a town's imagination for 2 decades had, in the coldest, strangest sense, been an act of protection. but someone was still watching, and the story was not finished unraveling yet. When Frank Callahan finally located Melissa Carter, now 51 years old, and the woman he believed to be Ava Bennett, now 26, they were living under new names in a small town in Kentucky, a place chosen, it would later emerge, almost at random off a map years earlier, working, respectively, as a hospice nurse who her co-workers described as the kind of person who held dying strangers' hands, like family, and a graduate student in social work, a field she had gravitated toward. She would later say, without ever fully understanding why, until she learned her own history, a detail that struck Callahan as almost unbearably poignant given everything the journal had revealed about the woman who raised her. Rather than approach with police in tow, risking a third and possibly permanent disappearance, Callahan made contact first through a licensed intermediary trained in exactly this kind of delicate reunification work, a slow, careful process that stretched across nearly 6 weeks of letters and phone calls before either woman agreed to speak with him directly. Melissa, when the intermediary first reached her, reportedly went silent on the phone for nearly a full minute before asking only one question, her voice barely above a whisper. Was Ava going to be taken from her? She had spent 19 years bracing for exactly this call, rehearsing in her mind more times than she could count what she would say, what she would confess, what she would beg for, and when it finally came, she found she could barely speak at all. The intermediary assured her, as much as anyone could, that Ava was an adult, that no one could take her anywhere against her will, and that the goal of this conversation was simply the truth, whatever shape it eventually took. Ava's own reaction, when she was gently told that the woman she called Mom had a different name once, and that she herself had been born with a different name in a house 400 miles away, was one that investigators and therapists alike described as a kind of quiet, disorienting grief for a life she never got to have the choice to remember. She spent 3 weeks in intensive sessions with a trauma-informed therapist before agreeing to any direct contact with Sarah at all, working through what one clinician's notes described as a profound identity disruption compounded by an equally profound and equally real love for the woman who had raised her. Ava would later say the hardest part wasn't learning that Melissa had taken her. It was learning that Melissa had been right to. DNA confirmation, obtained with the young woman's full consent through a discreet cheek swab mailed to a lab rather than any kind of forced testing, confirmed what the library card and the photograph had already suggested with near certainty. She was Ava Bennett. She remembered almost nothing of her life before age 6, only fragments that surfaced sometimes in dreams she'd never been able to explain, a piano playing somewhere in a house she couldn't picture, the particular creak of a porch swing, a rabbit she still owned, worn nearly bald from decades of handling and packed carefully in tissue paper in a drawer in her apartment beside a handful of other keepsakes she'd never known the significance of, and a woman's voice, Melissa's voice, telling her over and over through her childhood, in whispered bedtime reassurances she'd absorbed the way children absorb the emotional temperature of a home without ever needing the words explained, that she was safe now, that nobody would ever hurt her again, that she never had to be afraid in this house the way she used to be afraid somewhere else. Ava, upon learning the full truth of her own history over the course of several long, tearful phone calls with Callahan, and later with a trauma-informed therapist brought in specifically to help her process 19 years of buried history all at once, made the decision to reach out to Sarah Bennett herself, choosing to control that reunion on her own terms after everything else in her life, including, in the truest sense, her own name, had been decided for her by other people, however desperately well-intentioned those decisions had been. The reunion, which a small documentary crew was later permitted to film with the full, careful consent of everyone involved, showed 2 women meeting for the first time in 19 years in a quiet hotel conference room in Asheville, chosen for its neutrality, soft lamplight, and a box of tissues already sitting untouched on the table between 2 chairs angled toward each other. Sarah's hands trembled so badly she couldn't hold the cup of coffee in front of her, setting it down twice before finally leaving it alone entirely, and Ava stood several feet back near the doorway for nearly a full minute, studying this stranger who was, impossibly, her mother, before finally closing the distance between them in 3 slow steps that felt, to everyone watching, like they took much, longer than 3 steps should. Sarah would later describe it, in the one interview she agreed to give after everything became public, as the moment 19 years of frozen grief finally thawed all at once, so overwhelming it felt, in her words, like drowning and being pulled out of the water in the same single, unbearable instant. Daniel Bennett was arrested in Ohio on charges related to child endangerment stemming from the newly documented pattern of abuse, charges complicated significantly by the statute of limitations in ways that frustrated prosecutors and satisfied almost no one, including Ava herself, who told investigators repeatedly that she wanted the truth known publicly far more than she wanted any particular punishment, handed down against a man she had, by that point, no memory of it all beyond a strange, wordless unease that surfaced whenever she saw certain photographs. Daniel's second wife, Carol, learning the full story for the first time alongside the rest of the country, ended their marriage within weeks, later telling a reporter she felt sick, imagining the years she'd spent defending a man's grief without ever understanding what that grief might have actually been hiding. Daniel pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in 2023, avoiding a trial that would have required Ava to testify, and received a sentence that many in Ridgemont Hollow, watching the case unfold 19 years after it first tore their town apart, felt was far too light for what the evidence, the pediatrician's notes, the preschool teacher's memory, and his own daughter's fragmented recollections ultimately suggested had happened inside that quiet Victorian house. Melissa Carter, facing potential charges related to the original disappearance, charges that could have included kidnapping despite the extraordinary context, cooperated fully with investigators from the very first conversation, providing detailed, consistent testimony that matched Colette's journal in every meaningful respect. In a decision that split public opinion nationwide when the story finally broke across national news outlets, generating debate on talk, shows, and op-ed pages for weeks, she was ultimately not prosecuted, the district attorney citing the extraordinary and unique circumstances, the independently documented history of abuse, and the fact that the young woman at the center of the entire case had explicitly and repeatedly asked the state, in writing, not to punish the person who had raised her with nothing but steady, unwavering love for 19 years. Diane Carter, Melissa's mother, did not live to see her daughter's name cleared, having passed away in 2019, still believing, without proof, in her daughter's goodness, a belief the entire investigation would ultimately vindicate 3 years too late for her to know it. Colette Marsh had died quietly in 2015 in a small assisted living facility under yet another alias, never knowing for certain whether the choice she helped make that November night had been the right one or simply the least terrible option available to two frightened people acting alone against a system that had failed to protect a child through every ordinary channel available to it. Her journal, in its final entry, written only weeks before her death in handwriting grown shaky and thin with age, expressed a hope that someday, somehow, the little girl she had only ever known from a careful, aching distance, who she had watched grow from 4 years old into a young woman entirely through secondhand reports and school photographs mailed by Melissa twice a year, would grow up safe, enough, and whole enough to someday understand, and perhaps even forgive her. News of the case's resolution reached Ridgemont Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon in late 2023, nearly 20 years to the season since Ava Bennett had vanished from that Victorian house on the edge of town. The Copper Kettle Diner, where the same 6 retirees still drank coffee at the same corner table 2 decades later, fell into a stunned, unusual silence when the local news broke into regular programming with the story. Sheriff Whitfield, 91 years old by then, and living in an assisted care facility 3 counties away, was called by a former deputy who thought he deserved to hear it from someone who knew him rather than from a television screen. He reportedly wept on the phone, repeating that he always knew that folded blanket meant something, that he'd carried the shape of it in his mind for 20 years without ever understanding what it was trying to tell him. The town organized a quiet gathering at the elementary school gymnasium, the same gymnasium that had served as search headquarters in 2003. Not a celebration exactly. Nobody quite knew what to call it, but a kind of communal exhale. Neighbors embracing each other in the same room where they had once pinned up flyers with Ava's 4-year-old face and Melissa's high school yearbook photo side by side. Sarah Bennett sold the Victorian house within the year. Unable, she said, to keep living inside a home built entirely around an absence that had finally, impossibly, been filled. She and Ava began building something neither of them tried to rush or force into a shape it wasn't ready for. Weekly phone calls that grew longer over time, a hesitant visit to Kentucky that stretched from a planned weekend into 10 days, the slow, unglamorous work of two women learning to be mother and daughter to each other for the first time as adults, without the shared history most families take entirely for granted. Ava kept her name, Ava Hale, the only name she had ever truly known herself by, a choice Sarah said she understood completely and never once tried to argue against. Melissa Carter, meanwhile, faced her own complicated homecoming, returning to Ridgemont Hollow for the first time in 20 years for a single, quiet visit to her mother's grave, where she knelt for nearly an hour in the cold, telling Diane Carter everything she had never gotten the chance to say while her mother was alive, that she had been right to believe in her, that she was sorry it took this long, that she hoped. Wherever she was, she finally knew the truth. Frank Callahan retired from private investigation work entirely in early 2024, telling a reporter who asked what case he might chase next that he didn't need another one, that this was the file he'd been carrying since he was 26 years old and he was finally, for the first time in his adult life, allowed to put it down. He kept, framed on his office wall, until the day he closed that office for good, a single photocopy of the note he'd written in blue ink so many years earlier, 4 words underlined twice. Something is not right. A reminder, he said, that sometimes the smallest, most dismissed detail in an entire case file turns out to be the one thread that unravels everything, if only someone is stubborn enough, or haunted enough, to keep pulling on it for 2 decades without ever letting go. Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply waits, folded neatly like a blanket on a porch swing for someone willing to keep looking. 19 years after a house went silent in the middle of a November night, a photograph hidden in the lining of a forgotten coat gave a mother back her daughter, gave a daughter back her past, and gave a town the ending it never thought it would get to have. Thank you for watching. If this case fascinated you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more incredible crime and mystery stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never stop asking questions.